EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. A new academic year is upon us, and it's time for an EWA Radio tradition, back to school story ideas. Today we're going to focus on the higher education beat, and joining me to share his cheat sheet for the fall and beyond is Mike Vasquez. He's a senior investigative reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education. Mike, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
You have some great story ideas to share, and I have a few of my own, so I want to jump right in. What is at the top of your list for 2024-25?
I look at back to school coverage as an opportunity and also a trap, in that let's not waste that opening, that window on narrowly tailored stories. So let's try to tackle some big fish, but use this as our peg, use this as our way in. And I think there are lots of things happening. This is an election year. Our society is in a strange place in a lot of ways. And you have encampments on college campuses because of the ongoing conflict in Gaza. And I think that's one of the first places I would look, because I look at the protest issue and how colleges handle protesters as really a values check, because higher education in general, and you see this on the left and the right and the center, people of all ideologies, but they look to higher education as this philosophical beacon, something sort of that stands for something when it comes to speech. But do they honor it? Will they honor it if there is pressure from state lawmakers, pressure from a governor, pressure from donors? And I think the answer is maybe at best. And so there is an opportunity there to really call out hypocrisy. And that's always been one of my favorite aspects of covering higher education, is that the hypocrisy is there. It is very frequently there. And it's a core part of our mission to call it out when we see it.
I like the idea of setting this up as sort of like the way in to open the door for some of these conversations. And I think that's a fair point, because we do have the audience's attention for the back to school window. As much as reporters may hate seeing those back to school pitches piling up in our inboxes right now, there is something about it where people sort of renew that focus and turn toward it, even when we're not in a time of active crisis, which I would argue and agree with you, higher ed certainly is right now.
To me, I think part of how this is an opportunity and a trap is, I remember there were times in my higher education reporting career, not at my current employer, but at previous employers, where I was pressured to cover college graduation ceremonies. And I objected, or it might not have been me, it might have been my editor that objected, but there were objections because we said, this is just the calendar. Like, people, graduations just happen. You know, if there's a compelling human interest example, if there's just a compelling thing happening at XYZ graduation, but you know, if you're working for a local paper, you don't want to write 6 graduation stories in April and May. Why are you doing that? The calendar exists. And I think the same thing is true for back to school. The calendar exists. Let's reach beyond that. Let's figure out what this moment means. Let's really kind of take advantage of the context that we have, because it's interesting context. There are times when the context ain't that interesting. This is interesting context moment for higher ed reporters around the country. So let's take some big swings. I almost look at it as don't go for a single or a double, go for the triple or the home run here.
You talked a little bit about this idea of cracking down on that hypocrisy and how campuses respond to these protests. Well, one of the responses that we've seen has been some high-profile resignations among college presidents. And that's another story you want to talk about. So let's shift over there.
It's interesting. I think back to my early days as a higher education reporter. I think I had the role of a college president all wrong. My understanding of it was very much in line with the public's understanding, which I think is truly not what it is. And what it is often your primary fundraiser, your primary political handshaker. And the academic piece of it, they may, or in many cases may not have any sort of expertise or even commitment to ideas like academic freedom or faculty governance. These are folks who are charming, but not necessarily academics and not necessarily planning on staying more than a couple of years, frankly. And so I think when we have any kind of search for college presidents, this has been one of the areas where I have seen time and time again that colleges can play very fast and loose with what's right and wrong. And so if there is an opening for any reporters listening, if there's an opening at one of the institutions that you cover for presidency, there are experts in how a presidency search should be conducted. you should absolutely reach out to a couple of those, because I guarantee you at least half the time they will deviate from the norm. They will deviate what are best practices. They will do things to either comply with external pressure or to reward this, that, or the other person. But it is not a process that I have confidence in at all. And that doesn't mean that every college president that is selected is awful, or that, just because it's a den of snakes doesn't mean that a good person can't rise up. But it is kind of a den of snakes in terms of this process. And it should be approached that way. I've seen way too many times. And I think this is the natural deference that the public gives to higher education. And that's the danger. As an early reporter covering higher education, I gave it a similar deference. I assumed you guys are up to good things, probably. Are they? I mean, have we really fact checked that? Like, if there's a presidential search, have we really requested 3, 4, 5, 6 FOIAs? Have we really gotten into the weeds of what's going on here? Because if we haven't, and we're just giving the benefit of the doubt, I think that's a dangerous situation where you could have an unqualified person rise to the top of a university. And I had a story that I wrote back in 2021 about a community college president in Texas who had, according to faculty anyway, done a ton of damage to that university. And there were some real questions about this individual's qualifications. There was a push to have him removed, but at the time he was able to hold on to his job. And we cannot overstate how important being the chief executive, the top dog of a gigantic institution that in many communities might be their primary employer. This is a big deal. This is almost like akin to being mayor of a small town or even a medium town. And when they try to slip somebody in, alarm bells should go off and we should get very, very aggressive.
Building off this idea about the fallout from the campus protests, and one of the things I've been thinking a lot about the past year is this idea of solidarity, this idea of what makes a campus community. And certainly the unheralded backbone of a lot of campus communities are the folks who are actually teaching the classes, particularly at big research one universities and places where they rely more on instructors than on tenured faculty, and a lot of folks who do not have job protections. And we've seen in the last year some organizing efforts by graduate students, certainly by those on tenured faculty, and the pushback. So I would advise reporters to pay close attention to what's happening on your campus in terms of who are those communities that are coming together to speak up for themselves and for others in this sort of fractured moment. I think that also speaks a lot to how a campus community is building or rebuilding itself, especially in an administration change. So, pay attention to some of those labor organizing efforts that are happening on your campus. And I would also say that extends to, some of the new rules from the NCAA when it comes to paying student athletes and student licensing. I think all of that's pretty fascinating and changes what the nature of college is in a way, and the purpose of a university, not just as an isolated bubble or enclave or individual development. We certainly hope it can be that, but these are big businesses.
They really are. And I think they get away with sort of the assumption that they're not. And that's how colleges get free land from city and county governments. I mean, although sometimes big businesses get free land too. But it's a different transaction when they give it to the university. It's a less scrutinized transaction when they give it to the university. It's almost there's a halo effect of we're doing this wonderful thing by giving this property, this tax break, this incentive to the university. And there is, I think, every reason in the world, whether it's athletics, whether it's how faculty of different categories are fairly or unfairly treated, there is every justification in the world to ask tough questions and to really scrutinize this, because colleges live and survive and thrive with our nearly unconditional support. So sometimes it's okay to place conditions on that support. Sometimes it's okay to say, hey, College X, this stinks. We've talked to X number of graduate assistants and something is wrong here. And it's really telling to me how there can be this reflexive pushback that I've gotten when I've written about colleges and universities. And I can speak to it. I was a graduate. I'm first in my family to graduate from college. I went to Florida International University, go Panthers. And when I worked at the Miami Herald, I just happened to have the professional obligation to write a number of stories that made them look bad, but it was their actions that made them look bad. I just published their actions. And I remember getting this evil side eye from like the president of my alma mater. Like I remember showing up to this event and I thought to myself, like I love you guys. Like I advocate for this institution everywhere I go. I've showed up to y'all's football games and you're horrible. And so can we get on the accountability train together, please? And so I think there is an opportunity and perhaps an obligation for journalists to get to the front of that accountability train and say, this is where we're going, college X, college Y, and there's no turning back.
It's fascinating because I was speaking with a higher ed reporter who's covering the community where she grew up, and the administrators are complaining about how tough she is on them. And she said to them, "You trained me. I'm a journalism major. I'm a credit to the institution. This is what you taught me to do." And I thought that was really a fabulous response.
Absolutely.
We're talking with Mike Vasquez of the Chronicle of Higher Education about his story, Ideas for the Coming Academic Year. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And please go over to Apple Podcasts if you would. Take a moment and rate us. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. Mike, you wanted to talk about the relationship between public and private institutions right now, that there's some story ideas on the radar for our listeners?
Sure. And I think one of the reasons why I sort of fell into this territory, and I think that's what happens sometimes in journalism, you have your intended stories for the year, and almost like the rip currents in the ocean, you get pulled in certain directions. And sometimes it's a good thing. And I've done a lot of work in the past about for-profit colleges. And because of that, there have been stories about partnerships between traditional flagship universities sometimes, or sometimes lesser known regional publics and for-profit companies. And I've often been tasked with taking a look at those and kind of trying to figure out, is this on the up and up or not? And sometimes not. And it's really sort of a puzzling thing to me, actually, the more and more I think about it, in that colleges in general, well, public colleges, let me restate that public colleges have been an enormous value for a long, long time. And even with tuition increases, you could argue that probably in most states of the country, there's a lot of value there. And at the same time, when they go to legislatures, these same public institutions, they talk about everything that they bring to the community. They talk about their alumni who have achieved enormous, incredible things. They boast, and they boast of all the things that they're capable of doing. And yet frequently when it comes to launching their online programs, when it comes to launching a new online nursing degree or online business degree, what have you, they say, we can't do that. That's over our heads. That's out of our league. So they hire these for-profit companies to sort of come in and co-operate it. Although in many cases, I had a story about 2U, and they were involved with a program, a medical program, where there was real criticism from faculty that 2U was kind of strong-arming the whole thing in a way that was bad for quality, because frankly, these companies are about money making, they're not about quality. And so you don't want the tail to wag the dog, but that's often what at least faculty and sometimes students will complain about, that the tail does wag the dog. But I've always been perplexed by this phenomena of colleges saying, and you have so many examples. You have the University of Arizona that partnered with Ashford University. You have the University of Idaho talking with the University of Phoenix. And these for-profit companies or slash sometimes colleges they're talking to sometimes have really questionable track records. And yet the colleges are racing to partner with them while professing incompetence, frankly, professing like we could never do this on our own. We could never build our own online program and take all the revenues on our own. Something doesn't add up. Something just doesn't pass the smell test. And I really do wonder if part of that song and dance, if you will, is that these online for-profit companies have become known, sometimes infamous, for very aggressive, sometimes very deceptive sales tactics in terms of recruiting students. And I do wonder if the fact that we see all these partnerships cropping up all over the country, and I have not seen any end to it, I do wonder if part of that, at least part of it, is that colleges want the unsavory recruiting tactics, but they don't want their name on it, at least not like completely. So they don't want a University of Arizona or a University of XYZ employee calling a single mom or calling a veteran and twisting their arm to enroll in perhaps a questionable online program. But they are willing to partner with companies that have done that for decades. And you have to wonder why. Are you committed to doing it the right way? And are you committed to building it the right way? Or is there just some sort of either laziness at best or corrupt intention at worst for why this keeps happening?
If I'm a reporter and I'm maybe brand new to the beat and I want to start this story, is a place to start to just write an email to the communications officer for the university and ask for a list of the public-private partnerships where you outsourcing this kind of work and just start doing a quick check on the companies they're already doing business with.
Yeah, I think when you're humming, I think that's the word I would go for. When I'm humming in the beat, it's almost if you imagine the movie Beauty and the Beast, like imagine like Belle's father or some crazy inventor, and they've got a bunch of things twirling in their workshop. They've got like this cuckoo clock that also makes eggs for breakfast and like this and that. And there's a hum. And I think you want the hum. And if you're at hum state, then there's really this almost seamless pivot from one story to the next because you've got good things cooking. Like I'll have one or two good cakes cooking. Okay, we just put the icing on that one. We published it. This one's getting ready. Let's grab that one. That there's a flow to it. Just if you were in a kitchen, the same thing. Like you want that hum, and part of that is just sending those simple, straightforward requests, such as the one you just mentioned, and doing it intentionally, doing it consistently, and then you get humming.
I want to emphasize to our listeners that we spend, and I say we, meaning media folks in general, we do spend a lot of time talking and thinking about the elite schools that educate anywhere from what, Mike, like 3 to 5% of the college students who are out there.
That sounds right.
And we want to make sure that we talk about stories about the schools that are doing the yeoman's job, educating a lot of people. And those are the community college systems. If you are not used to covering your community colleges, there's some great resources out there to help you do that, especially on the EWA website. Go to ewa.org, put in community college, and we'll pull up a ton of story ideas. But one that I would suggest to you that relates to what Mike has been talking about this for-profit universe, is to check with your community colleges and find out what are the career track programs that have the longest waiting lists. And what would it cost to earn your LPN or your RN or your dental hygienist or your veterinary tech assistant or your carpentry license if you are going through the community college system, and then compare that to what it would cost at a for-profit college or university in the immediate area, which is catching a lot of those overflow kids and young people and adults looking for retraining who don't necessarily want to wait on a waiting list for a year or 2 years. And then ask each of those institutions, the community college and the for-profit schools, for their placement list. What percentage of their students are actually finding the work in the jobs, in the fields where we know that we need those workers?
I think that's a really smart suggestion. And one thing I'll just piggyback on that for a moment is I recall during my time at the Miami Herald that there was a lot of competition in the nursing area, for example. And you had local community colleges. The South Florida area has among the best community colleges in the country. They've got Miami-Dade College, Broward College. Those are really good community colleges. And the nursing students in those programs typically do extraordinarily well. And what was happening in Florida was the legislature, as state legislatures are wont to do, was trying to pick winners and losers. And surprise, surprise, they weren't really trying to pick community colleges to be the winners. And this is, I think, a key piece of the puzzle in that if you talk to a community college, there are even sort of adult, vocational programs and adult vocational schools that are at a post-secondary level, sometimes run by school districts, and they can have some really good programs there as well. And so if there's some wonderfully affordable program for, it could be a healthcare career, it could be some sort of auto mechanic thing, it could be a million things. But if it's in demand and there's a waiting list, why? Like, I really want to know why. Like, I really want somebody to get on the phone and give me a good reason why. And I want to call them back and say, give me another one because I'm not sold on that first one. Because there are folks at the state political level that can get campaign contributions if they slow down that community college program. They're going to have some other company that wants to do the same thing. And the community college is not going to write a bunch of campaign checks. I mean, this is just how our world works, is how our system works. And so you can have really well-performing, affordable programs that are a win for consumers. And frankly, shamefully, you can have politicians who get in the way, who try to slow that down, who try to let other companies that are expensive and perhaps just not as good steal some of those students. And how do you think those students end up? Like, if I'm a student and I end up getting steered to a lackluster, expensive program because Representative John Smith won an extra $10,000 from some company, that stinks. And I think we have to be aware of how this works. And the fundamental question would be for a community college or, a public vocational institution of any sort. Oh, you have this thing that everybody loves. Why can't you expand? And then go off the record, probably, because they may not want to say, like, take whatever they'll say on the record, but go off the record because they may be scared of saying why they can't expand. They may be hesitant to tell you who's getting in the way because those could be elected officials who are betraying the public trust.
We talked just a moment ago about, of course, college affordability, and we could not do back to school stories for college without talking about student loan debt. Politicians are talking about it. Students are waiting to hear the latest with the Biden administration's promise to forgive student debt. And of course, we are moving into a new election cycle, which could throw everything into turmoil again. But Mike, what are your story ideas on that?
I think it's fascinating how the conversation unfolds when it comes to student loan debt, because there are so many people who are struggling immensely in their lives because of this. I think if I show up at somebody's job, if I show up at Wells Fargo headquarters, just to pick a company, and I give out cupcakes to a quarter of the people, I guess the other 75 people are going to be angry. And I think there's this jealousy. I think we need to talk about the jealousy factor, because I do think it drives some of the politics and the political incentives here, in that if I still have to pay my loans, why are you getting a freebie? That's just how people are going to feel sometimes. And I think one of the unfortunate consequences of that is that, as hopefully the federal government, there has been a spotty track record at best of the federal government even just honoring its own commitments when it came to loan forgiveness programs. The public service loan forgiveness program comes to mind, that there were just a ton of folks who qualified, who did all the right things. There's nothing wrong if your government tells you, you take this nonprofit job, you work for X years, we'll forgive your loans. As a person, as a citizen, as a taxpayer, as a borrower, you're not a freeloader. If you follow those rules and you do the thing, and then your government flakes out and doesn't give you the loan forgiveness, it's the government who's messing up. And I think that's part of the conversation here, and maybe it gets lost. I think the other piece of it is sometimes it's a shame to read stories about, let's say, I think in June or July, there were some court decisions involving the Biden administration and student loan forgiveness. It's a shame to read any stories like that don't talk to one or two borrowers. And hopefully you talk to more and you just quote the one or two best. But because it's a human issue, my understanding is that there are folks who have been put in limbo in terms of whether they're supposed to make payments. And I believe the interest accrues as they're waiting for the federal government to figure out what it wants to do. Like, can you imagine, like, you're trying to plot your financial future and maybe buy a house and start a family and do things that you deserve to have, and the government can't decide if it wants to go left or right, and so you're left with your interest ballooning. And so there is, I think, a consumer piece to this, that it's there, we talk about it, but frankly, I don't think we can talk about it enough.
Another piece of that, of course, was the tumultuous and some would argue disastrous rollout of the new FAFSA, of the federal system for financial aid for students. That's having an impact on colleges. Be sure to check with your institutions to see where things stand there. But related to that is a concern about how many students are going to show up this fall at each campus, and then also who's coming, in the next couple of years as we look at enrollment downturns. Mike, what should reporters be thinking about that?
I think this is an easy story to write in almost any community, as well as for national reporters. And when I say it's an easy story, it's the easy part of it is that this is a general phenomenon in the country, that you have this drop off in the pool of students. And at the same time, it's going to affect institutions in very different ways. There are going to be some institutions that don't feel a drop off or any sort of enrollment pressure whatsoever. And we have, the elite institutions, but also there'll just be other institutions that may not be sort of fancy and elite, but they still have a plethora of students who want to go there. And so I think it's a haves and have not kind of situation. And as a curious person, I think that's why I became a reporter in part. I want to know what's going on with the have-nots. Why is it that people don't want to go there? Why is it that things are kind of falling by the wayside? And it's an interesting opportunity to sort of look at higher education in your hometown, in your area. What's the nature of higher education, and who are the players that may not be playing much longer unless they can find an emergency solution? I think that's interesting. I think that there's going to be an alumni community even for those institutions Typically, they have less political pull. I mean, we can speculate all day long about why certain institutions suffer and are struggling to attract students now. But I think their stories deserve to be told. I think that at least some of those institutions are probably great at what they do. And if we're going to lose them, let's honor the loss, or let's at least chronicle the loss. Let's give people a choice of, do you want to lose this place because it's about to go under? And let's do that before and not after.
In terms of looking at enrollment declines, I'd also encourage listeners to think about what is exacerbating some of the trends we'd already been seeing for a few years. For example, we saw a real downturn even before the pandemic in men choosing higher education. That's only been exacerbated as the pandemic, we're still in the midst of it. It's not over. But also, students who are historically underserved, or even now more underserved, because they're the ones who are most likely to get hurt by things such as the FAFSA rollout mess, a downturn in availability of scholarships, and of course, the fallout from the Supreme Court's affirmative action decisions. I mean, all of that sounds, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer. I don't want to end on a negative note. So we're going to talk for a minute about one of my story ideas, which I think actually could be pretty exciting, and that is the role of youth voters on college campuses right now as we head into election year. I think if you're a higher ed reporter, get excited about covering this story. I think it's fascinating. Mike, you were the education editor for Politico before you joined Chronicle of Higher Education, so you have some experience with this.
I was in 2016. I remember watching the 2016 results come in the Politico newsroom. And one of the things I love about the youth voter story is I think a lot of times stories in general have these kind of shades of gray, and a good reporter does nuance. A good reporter takes the time to make that extra call and give readers the full story as opposed to just, pointing fingers. But at the same time, sometimes things are just black and white. And voter disenfranchisement is one of those things. It's usually kind of black and white. And people who do it typically have partisan or other blatant motivations for trying to disenfranchise voters. So I think there are moments in our career, in our role, that we serve democracy. I mean, there's a reason why our job is in the Constitution. And I think chronicling the efforts of young people to engage with the voting process, and not all of it might be mischievous things to disenfranchise voters. There may be other hiccups in terms of voters feeling comfortable or interacting with this new political apparatus, new to their lives anyway. And we should care about that. Like, as citizens, we should care about that, because that's the welcome mat to our democracy. These are college students who are paying good money to learn stuff. You would think they would be engaged, motivated voters. If they feel pushed out, what hope do we have for the future?
A couple of questions reporters can be asking on Youth Vote. Are there polling stations on campus? If not, where are the closest ones? And how are students getting to them if they're using them to vote? How many of them are doing absentee ballots? How difficult is that, or how easy are the states making it? And a lot of institutions, I found this kind of fascinating, are folding automatic voter registration into their freshman orientation sessions, which are often conducted online. A lot of institutions started doing that in the pandemic, and they've kept it up because it's pretty efficient. And for example, in some states, and I will say they're usually blue states, a pop-up message comes in the middle of the orientation and students can automatically register to vote. I found that fascinating.
I think ultimately this is going to be a big part of the election results come November.
It absolutely is. And when you get to the point of looking for that story on the voter impact, be sure to check out Circle at Tufts University. They're the folks doing the most research looking at the impact of the youth vote, and they're a fantastic resource. And so are you, Mike. Thank you very much for making time for EWA Radio with your story ideas for the fall.
Thank you for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.